One important note of mention before we begin is that the Clean Energy Solutions Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solutions Center's resource library as one of many best practices, resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. Today's webinar is centered around presentations from our guest panelists, Abraham Ellis, Gunter Konzelmann, Domingo Mateo, and Mauricio Cuellar, who have joined us to discuss frameworks, tools, and practices for reducing energy system vulnerabilities to natural and man-made threats. Please note the first two presentations will be in English, and the case studies from Mexico and the Dominican Republic will be presented in Spanish. These case studies will be posted in both English and Spanish on the Solutions Center training page. Before we jump into the presentations, I will provide a quick overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. And following the presentations, we will have a question and answer session where the panelists will address questions submitted by the audience. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be automatically prompted to fill out a brief survey. So we thank you in advance for taking a moment to respond. This webinar is provided by the Clean Energy Solutions Center, which focuses on helping government policymakers design and adopt policies and programs that support the development of clean energy technologies. This is accomplished through support in crafting and implementing policies related to energy access, no-cost expert policy assistance, peer-to-peer learning and training tools, such as this webinar. And the Solutions Center is co-sponsored by the governments of Australia, Sweden, and the United States with in-kind support from the government of Mexico. This webinar is also being held in support from the ECPA Ministerial, which takes place in Chile next month. The Solutions Center provides several clean energy policy programs and services, including a team of over 60 global experts that can provide remote and in-person technical assistance, no-cost virtual webinar training on a variety of clean energy policy topics, partnership building and development agencies and regional global organizations to deliver support, an online library containing over 5,500 clean energy policy-related publications. Our primary audience is made up of energy policymakers and analysts from governments and technical organizations in all countries, but we strive to engage with the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. The Solutions Center is an international initiative that works with more than 35 international partners across its suite of different programs. Several of the partners are listed above, including research organizations like IRENA and the IEA, programs like SE4All, and regionally focused entities such as the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. A marquee feature that the Solutions Center provides is no-cost expert policy assistance, known as AskanExpert. This service matches policymakers with one of more than 60 global experts selected as authoritative leaders on specific clean energy, finance, and policy topics. For example, in the area of energy resilience, we are pleased to have Mr. Michael Milton Wu of Converge Strategies serving as one of our experts. If you have a need for policy assistance in energy resilience or any other clean energy sector, we encourage you to use this valuable service. Again, this is provided free of charge, and if you have a question for our experts, please submit it through our simple online form at cleanenergysolutions.org/expert. We also invite you to spread word about this service to those in your networks and organizations. Now I'd like to provide brief introductions for today's panelists. First up is Dr. Abraham Ellis, who leads the Photovoltaic and Distributed Systems Integration Department at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Following Dr. Ellis, we will be hearing from Gunter Konzelmann, who is the Director of the Center for Energy, Environmental, and Economic System Analysis at Argonne National Laboratory. The first of our two case studies, we'll hear from Domingo Mateo, who is the Director of Energy Security of the Vice Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure at the Ministry of Energy and Mines of the Dominican Republic. And our final speaker today is Mauricio Cuellar. He is the manager with the National Energy Control Center in Mexico. And with those introductions, I would like to welcome Abe to the webinar.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So am I ready now?
You're ready. Feel free to share the presentation.
Okay, let's make sure everybody can see the screen.
That looks perfect.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Just as a matter of a quick introduction, let me just say that I have been working in this space of energy systems and renewable energy for a very long time, and I wanted to share with the group here, especially given the audience, that we do have some experience working in renewable and energy projects in Latin America. That was actually my first job here, working in the energy sector in the United States. Was doing a lot of work in Mexico, Dominican Republic, other places in Latin America, looking at energy for development applications. And what we're going to be talking about today in terms of energy resilience is kind of a natural evolution of application of renewable energy and other kinds of resources to the challenges that we have, of course. I do speak Spanish. I'm originally from Panama, so feel free to ask some questions if you like in Spanish, and I'll try to reciprocate with the same. Let me first of all say that the material in this presentation is very large. It's a lot of thoughts that came together to put this material here. I do not anticipate that I will have time to go through all of this, obviously, but I will try to cover what I can in about 20-25 minutes at the most. Not all what's in here will be covered, but I'll start with some motivations and definitions here. I know Gunter will also reinforce some of this. I'll talk a little bit about some of the framework and tools that we have been developing here at Sandia National Labs, but it's just a view of the many approaches that National Labs and others have to solve this problem. And so when you hear from Gunter, you'll see that all of us working in this space have different ways of approaching this issue. Okay, so next question. Let me see, just a second. Turn this off here. I do want to get through at least one of these application examples. I have 3 in the package that will be distributed. One is for a city scale resilience example, focusing on New Orleans, Louisiana. I have another one focusing on a rural community in Alaska called Shubnak, and a third one for a transportation system in the New Jersey area. That's also very interesting. If you have any questions about those after you review the material, I'll be happy to follow up with you. This opening slide is just to give you an idea of the family of national laboratories that exist in the United States. There's 17 in total. You see the picture of Gunter there on the top right. He's at Argonne National Laboratories in Chicago, and a picture of myself in the south here with Sandia National Laboratories. We have 2 major offices, one in California, one in Albuquerque, where I live. And I wanted to just say that the Department of Energy National Laboratories, as well as many other government organizations here in the United States, are very much focused on helping to make resilience mainstream. It is not a concept that really has been widely adopted, and definitely does require a lot of work to make it go mainstream. In a matter of the motivation, I think this is something you all know, but just to very briefly describe the reason why we're working on this, we look at trends in terms of threats to critical infrastructure, and those threats are on the rise. Some of it has to do with what's going on with climate patterns. Some of it has to do with the introduction of new technologies like information technology, for example, as an integral part of this critical systems. And as you can see there on the right-hand side, there are vulnerabilities on the increase with respect to cybersecurity and those types of things as well. The electric system is especially vulnerable to all of this. We have seen, I give you some figures there, somewhere between $25 and $70 billion of economic losses in the United States are attributable to power system outages, as you can see. So for us, the resilience of the electric power system in particular is of great importance. One example of this was in 2012. We had a major storm that I'm sure all of you remember, Superstorm Sandy, that hit the eastern coast of the United States. Very dense population centers, and obviously had quite a lot of impact there. It was by far the costliest and the largest natural disaster, by several metrics that we've had in the United States. Took over 2 weeks to restore power to a lot of the communities here. and almost 10 million, well, actually almost 9 million people were affected by the outages. Very, very large scale. This is the kind of threats that exemplify the need for the concept of resilience, because the reliability concepts that we have now for critical infrastructures do not include what we call acts of God or anything that is beyond the control of your sort of normal failure of equipment and things like that. And so we need to have a way to do some practical planning and operations for large-scale events like this. Following Hurricane Sandy, there was a policy directive that came from the White House here in the United States. The president basically required all the federal agencies to look at strengthening security and resilience for all of the critical infrastructure in the United States, for all hazards, and taking into consideration things like national security, economic stability, health and safety, and so on. So it's a different view of what needs to be done, and so now the federal agencies are very well aligned, not just the Department of Energy, but also the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, etc., are all aligned to comply with this policy directive. I will also say that the same policy directive provided a definition of resilience that the agencies are using now. It is defined as the ability to prepare, adapt, withstand, and recover from these disruptions. And it also provided a definition of what all hazards mean, right? So basically, it required these agencies to focus on low probability, high consequence events like natural disasters and cyber incidents, pandemics, and such things in order to do planning for the future. This graphic here shows in a very simple way the difference between reliability and resilience. In our point of view, resilience encompasses reliability, if you will. It focuses on, as I said, low probability and high consequence events, like the ones pictured on the right-hand side, things that end up breaking down significant parts of the critical infrastructure. And then also, as I mentioned before, this is not a concept that has methods, metrics, and tools that have been well established or adopted by the industry. We still have a lot of work to do there. Therefore, all of the efforts that we're putting into resilience. Very quickly here, I wanted to mention that Sandia National Laboratories, like many other labs, has been looking at resilience of critical infrastructure for a very long time. Something like 20 years ago, we developed a series of tools and frameworks to look at security risk for critical infrastructure, ranging from dams to transmission systems all the way to biohazards of communities. And those tools and methodologies and software tools have evolved to what it is that we're doing today. You can see some references on the right-hand side to some of that early work, again, over 20 years ago, but very much relevant to what we are doing now. This wheel here is what we call the Sandia Resilience Analysis Framework, something that has been proposed to help the community kind of rally around a vision for how to do resilience in a manner that is consistent, that is, and we are able to repeat in terms of the analysis, something that we can apply metrics that are consistent. And so basically, the process is what you would expect. It starts simply with the definition of the goals. You do have to define the system. You have to characterize the threats. You have to determine at some point through simulation or analysis the level of disruptions that might be applicable to the goals, the resilience goals, and the system that you're working with. You have to calculate how those disruptions translate into consequences using models. And then finally, you have to provide some evaluation of different examples or different proposed solutions that would increase resilience. And so that's basically what the process is. Somebody else's framework, because there are several of these, basically go through the same process. And in my opinion, there are different flavors of the same idea, but we do have to converge on some sort of a framework. So here's one example. We have also been using a different example here for urban resilience specifically, and it's a wheel similar to the one before. This one rotates to the right. But as you can see, some of the concepts are very different, very similar, although the wheel looks a little different. They're very similar. This one in particular emphasizes the need for stakeholder engagement. You can't really do very much in terms of investment and decision making around these very expensive projects unless we have the stakeholders at the table. But in general, the result of this is the same: a set of resilience options that can be considered for investment, whether it is the private sector or the public sector. In terms of the metrics that are applicable, there is again a lot of discussion in this area, but there are a few places where we converge in terms of a vision here. We do want metrics that are specific to the threat. Metrics are defined basically with respect to this threat. They can be performance-based or attribute-based. They need to be expressed in terms of the consequences, and I'll go into a little bit more of that. We think that they need to be probabilistic in nature, and as Gunter will also reinforce, they also have to be practical. They need to be scalable and consistent across its application. Some of the metrics that we end up using in a particular resilience analysis is not one metric, but a combination of different categories of metrics. You can see some of these on the screen. The first one has to do with electric services, things like how many hours customers might be out of electricity service. But as you progress down to the bottom, you can see that some of the metrics associated with social and economic impact, for example, the number of people that do not have access to critical services like water, for example, or food, those kinds of things, or the impact to the local economy are parts of the metrics that we also want to include in the analysis. So it gets fairly complicated. In terms of the investment options, we found it very useful to provide tools and methodologies to arrive at a conceptual design. This is something that is very important to engage stakeholders and drive decision making. But basically, these conceptual designs are technical descriptions of resilience improvements, and we also have to attach to them a cost estimate so that we can then make a decision about how to proceed. And so a lot of what we've done in the last few years here in terms of resilience is to provide some tools for the optimization of this conceptual design. Here's one of those tools that we use at Sandia National Laboratories. It's called the Microgrid Design Toolkit. It's a decision support tool that fits in this early stage resilience analysis framework to work with conceptual designs. It allows stakeholders to provide technical information for options for specifically grid resilience solutions, and it does an optimization of those solutions in order to come up with the best possible investment alternatives to improve resilience. As I mentioned before, these types of tools provide a lot of the information that will be needed, but there will still be required information for the specific application. So there's an equipment database, for example, things like energy production equipment, generators, things like that, reliability information for those types of equipments. But we also have to put into it things like mission requirements. What is it that you want to do? And of course, there has to be a description of the model. But what you end up with is a trade-off of performance and reliability and cost and resilience so that you can compare solutions. So here's one example of how we do it. All of these solutions represented by each of these dots on the screen are feasible solutions that would solve the problem, basically. But they give you kind of a trade-off between performance and cost, right? So the highest cost solutions would be the ones that are to the very left. So point A, for example, would be the most expensive solution, but point A on the top of the graph there would also be the solution that gives you the biggest or the best performance, right? And so you can see that as you progress to the right, you get solutions that are lower in cost, but also the performance is a little bit lower. And so this is, as you would expect from any normal decision making, a balance between cost and performance. And this is the kind of tool that provides information in that regard. So, Stephanie, how am I doing on time? Do I have 5 more minutes to go over an example here?
Yes, you have 5 more minutes.
Great, thank you so much. I do have 3, as I mentioned, in the packet that you are free to take a look at and ask questions later if you like. At least what I'd like to do today is go over one, which is an urban resilience example for the city of New Orleans. It is an example that has to do with a major flood scenario, a very timely topic, as I'm sure have seen in the news. We're dealing with a situation, especially like this in Texas, and the work that we did in Louisiana was very much motivated by such a scenario. So first of all, the city itself, you see where it's located in the southern coast of the United States. It is a very peculiar city in the sense that much of the populated areas are actually very close to or slightly below sea level. The picture there on the bottom there gives you an idea of the profile along a street, let's say, on the city. You can see there on the left-hand side that the Mississippi River its normal elevation is quite a bit higher than the rest of the city is, shown in orange. Over on the right-hand side is a lake, a very, very large lake called Lake Pontchartrain, which also happens to be above the level of where some of the city infrastructure is. During a hurricane scenario where you have lots of winds or a flooding scenario with lots of rains, the concern, of course, is that the level of those bodies of water might end up threatening or inundating parts of the city. So this is a very major concern there in New Orleans. How they deal with this threat is a combination of levees and pumps. Basically, as you can see there on the picture, they have walls, levees is what we call these, around both the river and the Lake Pontchartrain over on the top side. Those levees have been built by the Army Corps of Engineers over many years, very expensive infrastructure, and they are built, of course, with planning for things like 100-year events and things like that. So they are planned with resilience in mind. The pumps as well, as you can see a picture of a pumping station there on the top side, are built with the same kind of resiliency in mind. These are multiple generators with multiple pumps, with multiple facilities, so that you can, basically maintain performance even if you have failures in some of these systems. These are very unique pumping stations. They work not out of the normal 60 hertz utility power. They work at something like 25 hertz or something like that. And so they're very specialized, very old equipment, but also very highly reliable. Obviously, the best efforts, engineering efforts, are challenged sometimes. So these are pictures of what happened with Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. That was a direct hit in New Orleans. Partly as a result of this history and the concern over the fact that the electric system was also down, not just flooded, but the electric system that supplies the pumps also failed, motivated the Department of Energy to collaborate with the city of New Orleans. Sandia, National Laboratories, in partnership with other organizations that you see on the right-hand side, are working together to really try to understand how we can provide options for cost-effective grid enhancement in the city of New Orleans, to figure out a way to apply these methodologies and tools even under very high uncertainty and show that we can do something in terms of decision making, and then demonstrate how to best demonstrate its benefits to the stakeholders that need to not only pay for these facilities but also maintain them and keep them in a sustainable manner into the future. So consistent with the methodology that I described a minute ago, we went through the effort of defining the threat scenario. In this case, it was a Category 3 or Category 2 storm with a surge in the 24-foot range with 20 inches of rain. We looked at 2 different tracks of a possible future hurricane. One of them was the Katrina track in 2005. The other one was a 1947 storm that did not have a name, but we do have some data for that. We looked at pumping capacity down to about 50%, and a situation where the city did not evacuate for that scenario. So we do what you normally would imagine, right? We characterize the threat in terms of the winds and the flooding patterns that you would see in the city. So this is some examples of the results that we got. This information then was used to try to understand which parts of the critical, what we call lifetime infrastructure services would be impacted. And we looked at anything, including electric power, drinking water, all the way to things like food and transportation. Obviously, there are many people involved here, city officials, fueling stations, schools, commercial service providers, for example, the utility called Entergy, et cetera. So we did have to work with all of these stakeholders. As I mentioned before, it is a stakeholder-driven process. And I'm getting to the end here, Stephanie. The technical approach was agreed upon among the stakeholders. In this particular case, there was an interest in making sure that each of these 4 sectors of the city had critical infrastructure provided for. And so we also went through consideration of various technical and social factors, for example, the location of the infrastructure, what power outages could be expected, where the population would move in case of flooding, and things like, of course, the cost of providing these resilience options. This is an example of the kind of analysis that we did. You start with the location of where these infrastructure systems are. The one on the left are more centralized. These are infrastructure that provide services to the entire city, whereas the ones on the right-hand side are distributed resources like shelters and police stations and drainage pumps that are more localized to the communities. We, of course, in this case, used a GIS analysis tool to understand how these critical infrastructure clusters, and based on that, we came up with a range of options that you see on the screen now. These are now candidate microgrid deployments that are being considered by the city government in New Orleans to make some investments. And so it works. We demonstrated in this case that it can be done. Let me jump over now to my summary slide here to just say, in conclusion here, that the critical infrastructure resilience, obviously, is a topic of very high interest. Energy especially is of very high interest to all of us that are working in this space. These problems are not easy to solve. They're technically complex. They deal with a lot of uncertainty, but we can do it with these resilience frameworks, metrics, and tools that we have developed and are trying to validate in many different places. We can show that this resilience approach is feasible in a rigorous manner, and more work obviously has to be done in order to make sure that these principles are widely adopted. So with that, I hope I stay within my 25 minutes here. Stephanie, I'll take any questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much. Now we would like to hand things over to Gunter from Argonne National Laboratory.
All right, hello. Can everyone hear me? All right.
Sounds great, and the presentation looks good too.
Presentation looks great too. All right, perfect. Thank you, everyone. I'm honored to be part of the webinar, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. In fact, my wife did grow up in the city of New Orleans. Her home that she used to grow up in was damaged, completely destroyed in a storm. I have a sister-in-law who used to live in the city of New Orleans until Hurricane Katrina hit, evacuated to the city of Houston, never moved back, stayed in Houston, is now exposed to Hurricane Harvey. So this is a topic that hits home really personally, and I'm excited to talk about the work that we do. So Abe already introduced the National Lab System, and like talked about the work that he and his group do at Sandia, and of course pointed out Argonne National Laboratories. So we're another one of the national laboratories that reports to the Department of Energy, one of 17 national laboratories. So we're family labs working together, trying to tackle this issue from various different perspectives. So this first slide basically just shows that we take capabilities across our national laboratory, from advanced mathematics and computational expertise to develop models for various different purposes, to then apply those models to address a particular critical issue. And resilience, of course, is one of those areas where we do a lot of model applications, all the way to deploying those tools to outside external customers. These customers could be grid operators, emergency management personnel, the Department of Energy, private sector industry players, a variety of different customers. What we do bring to the table in terms of capabilities is we sort of cover the entire spectrum of what you need to look at when you are trying to address and analyze resilience concerns. So we typically start out with defining the scenario. This could be an all hazards approach, could be ranging from a typical natural event like a hurricane or a snowstorm or a blizzard, earthquakes, to man-made events like cyber attacks. You then translate that initiating event into a physical impact. What infrastructure, what particular assets are being damaged, what transmission lines are being knocked over, what substations will be flooded, what power plants is going to be inundated. And then you do a system modeling where you try to translate those physical impacts into a system impact. Will the loss of a number of power plants or substations or transmission lines lead to cascading events where you might have a local or regional or larger scale outage, blackouts for power generation, for example. And then, of course, you have to worry about how can I bring back the power as quickly as I can to as many people as I can. So you need to look at restoration efforts, restoring the power, shipping equipment, shipping supplies. So there's response logistics, there's logistical modeling involved, and as well as restoration and response modeling. So all of this is, we have tools that sort of cover this. And so we go from taking data. A lot of these models require a lot of data, as you might be aware of. So there's data, of course, involved that describes the hazards. Then there's data that you'll need to describe the infrastructure that you're modeling. Then you have to take this data into the models, and you want to use your models to design tools that withstand these large-scale events, to be resilient to these major events that occur every once in a while. But at the same time, you want to make sure that while it's resilient to these occasional major events, it also in the day-to-day, daily operations, that the systems are economically operational and a typical daily reliable operation. So you have to be concerned about both reliability as well as resilience. And then you can take it from modeling and simulation to operational assessment and real-time collaboration in terms of exercising events to try to prepare yourself better. Often what we do is we prepare drills, we prepare exercise, and we try to get ready for the situation should an event occur. And so we can apply these models and tools and data to these real-time exercises and drills, even can take this to real-time events. And I'll show a few examples down the stretch. So in terms of data, obviously there's a lot of the infrastructure data, and that's very country specific. We have a lot of data sets on the U.S. electrical infrastructure and the petroleum infrastructure, natural gas infrastructure. So we have reasonably good information on the infrastructure. Then, of course, we have to define the hazards, and the hazards can, of course, typically we describe those using historical information, but of course, given climate change, we have to look forward. And so if we want to design a system that withstands not just current events, current hazards, but possibly future hazards, then we have to see how the weather will be different 20 years from now, 50 years from now, towards the end of the century. So we have on our supercomputer, we have models that allow us to develop very detailed, downscaled, very local 12 kilometer by 12 kilometer resolution climate data that allows you to download this. This is 600 terabytes of data that was run on our supercomputer for millions of computing hours. And this data is used in the US to do regional resilience studies for example, to analyze not just what might occur to a current event, but what might occur to an event where it will happen in 30 years from now, or mid-century, or towards the end of the century. So this is data that covers the entire North American continent, including the Caribbean, and we're currently also working on some downscaling data for South America, including Brazil. So in terms of the modeling, we sort of think of it as a few major buckets, 4 major buckets. What can you do to prepare yourself before the event? As you can anticipate the event occurring, think of Hurricane Harvey being projected to make landfall on the Texas coast. So what can I do to prepare myself? What can I do during the event to mitigate, to reduce the impact that this event might have? And then how can I quickly respond and recover? And so if you think of this timeline as the event occurs, then we have tools that fall into those 4 buckets. And obviously, I do not have the time to cover all of those. If you are interested in a particular topic or model, feel free to send me emails, contact me through the webinar link, or by email, and I can send more information. But there's a range of tools available. So just to highlight a few of them, there's models that look at the electric power infrastructure to say, what if an event happens? How does that impact the grid? Are there pockets of outages? Are there smaller local pockets of outages expected under this event, or are there regional outages? And same thing we can do for the natural gas infrastructure and the petroleum infrastructure. And we also have a tool that looks at the telecommunications infrastructure. Then, of course, we have tools that are specific to hurricanes, and I will talk just a little bit. I'll show you an example of how we use this head-out model in terms of estimating electrical impacts from hurricanes. And then we have models that look at the restoration of the physical infrastructure, the repair times, as well as the grid restoration. What if you had a major outage? How long would it take to bring power back to individual customers down to the zip level or the county level or the state level? This is a tool that shows you, this now takes you into the exercises. So this is the information sharing and the situational awareness tool and platform that's been developed over many years for the emergency management community in the United States. This provides essentially situational awareness and a common operating picture, not just for during drills and exercise. And you see a few examples of these drills that have recently been held with state agencies or with power companies and even with retailers, but also during the actual event. And this tool is widely developed, widely distributed, lots of users, lots of organizations use this. And this is used for regional exercises as well as national level exercises. Here's an example of the over 60 regional resilience studies that Argonne has done over the last 7, 8 years. These are studies that cover all kinds of infrastructures. They could look at oil, they could look at gas infrastructure, electric infrastructure, water infrastructure. They typically identify vulnerabilities in the system to particular events, and then try to identify resilience measures of how I could minimize that vulnerability. How could I fix that vulnerability to reduce the impact of that event were it to occur? You can see that we have done almost nationwide coverage in supporting emergency preparedness, emergency management agencies. This includes exercises, drills, modeling in terms of preparing yourself for a major event. This slide shows you a few of the exercises that we have done for the Department of Energy. Typically regional exercises, once a particular event, looking at the impacts, how can I prepare myself, how do I respond to something like this, and not just the power grid operators, but how does everybody respond together to minimize impacts, economic impacts, as well as casualties. Here's an example that we've recently completed for the Midwestern United States, where we simulated a cyber attack on the power grid. You can see the chart in the middle bottom sort of shows you the regional outage, the power outage that occurred. and then we're sort of trying to simulate how long would it take location by location to restore the power, all the way to around sort of clockwise it goes all the way to the chart at the bottom right, which shows you the customer restoration time, how many customers get restored after 1 day, after 3 days, after 5 days, after 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks. Very important to prepare yourself for this. If you have power out for 4 weeks, you have a major logistical issue, so you have to work together across the community to correct this and to address this. One or two more examples, and I'll wrap it up. This is so we do work with for the government agencies, a variety of different government agencies, but also we work with private sector. This is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. We've worked with them for the last 2 years. They do their own drills and exercises. They do 2 drills every year, one in spring to prepare themselves, and this always happens to be a hurricane very close to Harvey. And then in fall, they typically drill on the response recovery. How could I get back power if there is a major power outage in the nation? Power out essentially in the entire half of the country. And so this is the last example I'm showing. This is the tool that we're actually currently running nonstop. This is in relation to Hurricane Harvey. So we're on standby. As anytime a hurricane is expected to make landfall 5 days out, we're providing real-time information back to the Department of Energy as well as other government agencies. What might be the estimated impact? How many customers do we expect to be out of power 4 days out, 3 days out, 2 days out, 1 day out? And then every time NOAA comes out with a new storm trajectory, we update our model, and this information gets fed to a situational report that goes to DOE, and then it's circulated to all the federal government as well as all the impacted state governments. So this is happening in real time. So in summary, we have extensive experience and expertise and offer a range of tools to meet stakeholder needs, not just in the energy sectors, but also in the emergency management sectors, because both have to work together to reduce the impacts of a major disaster occurring. We provide tools that allow you to obtain better enhanced situational awareness, identify vulnerabilities in your systems, identify possible resilience mitigation measures, and then also we're supporting actively operational drills and exercises for faster and more efficient response and recovery. So we work with a range of diverse stakeholders, including industry participants in the electricity and the power side and the natural gas side, telecommunication side, as well as emergency response agencies. And we look forward to engaging with some of you in the next subsequent to this webinar. So if you have any questions, there's email addresses and phone numbers for a number of people that work in this space at my lab. With that, I'll turn it back to the organizers.
Great. Gunter, thank you so much. That presentation was wonderful. Next, we will go into the case studies that will be presented in Spanish. Our first case study panelist is Mr. Domingo Mateo, who is from the Dominican Republic. And Mr. Mateo, over to you. All right, it looks like we're having a few connection issues, so we are going to skip ahead and we'll actually do the case study from Mexico first and try to get Mr. Mateo back on the line. So we will hand things over to Mr. Mauricio Cuellar. And Mauricio, can you hear us all right? All right, we can see your presentation, but there isn't any audio right now. Are you able to hear us? All right, everyone, one moment. We're going to try to fix the audio for Mr. Cuellar. Hold on, please. Apologies for the delay, everybody. We are just trying to connect Mr. Cuellar's audio in one moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. That sounds wonderful.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, voy a hablar en español. Estos son los desastres naturales que tenemos en México y para los cuales operamos el sistema eléctrico para evitar o tratar de evitar interrupciones a los usuarios y restaurar el servicio lo más pronto posible. Tenemos huracanes, frentes fríos o tormentas de nieve que nos pegan muy poco. El efecto es severo, pero son muy poco frecuentes en México. También tenemos la parte de incendios forestales, tornados en la parte norte del país y sismos. Explicaré primero las medidas preventivas que usamos en el caso de huracanes. En huracanes primero prevemos la ruta, el seguimiento a la trayectoria del huracán. Formalizamos las acciones con los diferentes procesos, tanto con los generadores, con el dueño de la red de transmisión y con el dueño de la red de distribución, es decir, transportistas, distribuidores y generadores. Preparamos las instalaciones. Tenemos un poco más de personal en los centros de control involucrados para estar haciendo análisis de seguridad operativa en tiempo real. Hacemos escenarios por donde va a pasar el huracán de perder todos los corredores de transmisión o los que tengan mayor probabilidad. La parte de CFE, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, nos proporciona las rutas en el mapa de por dónde va a pasar y los mayores riesgos de la red de transmisión. Entonces nos preparamos desde el punto de vista del sistema eléctrico para tratarlo de hacer confiable, soportando incluso contingencias dobles, no solo sencillas, dobles o hasta triples en el caso de trayectorias que vayan juntas de la red de transmisión. Ya cuando está el evento, ubicamos reservas operativas, sacamos políticas operativas, determinamos qué contingencias pueden ser probables, ubicamos la reserva de generación, la reserva rápida, la reserva fría. En la red de transmisión se bloquea lo que se llama el recierre, para que si el recierre monopolar, por si hay algún daño, no recierra automáticamente, porque ya puede haber una falla, puede haber muchas probabilidades que la torre esté derribada, que haya elementos en la torre, láminas, etcétera, derivado del mismo huracán. Revisamos los esquemas de acción remedial o los RASes, que es en inglés RAS. Seccionamos la red si es necesario. La frecuencia la mantenemos en 60 Hz. Hacemos, si se nos formaran islas eléctricas, tratamos de que las islas pues sigan manteniendo los 60 Hz. También regulamos el voltaje y hacemos control de flujos de potencia para prepararnos para la siguiente contingencia. Durante el evento, lo que les comentaba, tenemos personal haciendo corridas de seguridad operativa con herramientas en tiempo real, herramientas de análisis de redes, hacemos redespachos de generación, si hay que redespachar la generación según lo que vaya ocurriendo, nunca sabemos qué va a ocurrir. Hacemos procedimientos para restablecer usuarios, restablecer carga y red eléctrica, y hacemos un reporte de las condiciones hasta ese momento que vayan en la red. Después del evento, pues se identifican qué elementos de la red eléctrica tienen falla permanente. Obviamente seguimos manteniendo el sistema, las variables como son frecuencia, voltaje y flujos de potencia. Aplicamos procedimientos de restablecimiento si se requieren y de mantenimiento de la red. Recuperamos muchas veces, se afecta también la comunicación, la telecomunicación, entonces usamos radios satelitales muchas de las veces, radios y teléfonos satelitales. Como les comentaba, si hay islas eléctricas, pues nos dedicamos a su sincronismo. Se hace una reunión con los mismos procesos del inicio para que en los daños permanentes nos den un panorama de cuándo se recuperarán los elementos para volver a la normalidad. En el caso de frentes fríos o tormentas invernales, que son poco frecuentes, pero ya nos ocurrió uno en 2011 muy severo para el norte de México. Prácticamente es algo similar a lo de los huracanes. Vemos las instalaciones que pueden ser dañadas en el frente frío. Verificamos la área de influencia. Ahí particularmente checamos con la parte de transmisión porque el SF6 se puede congelar. El aislamiento se puede congelar y también los transformadores. En los transformadores de aceite ya tuvimos varios eventos con frentes fríos que el volumen se reduce y hace que opere la protección Buchholz del transformador y se pierdan transformadores. Entonces todo eso lo estamos verificando previamente. Vemos la parte de qué condiciones de generación existen, la disponibilidad de combustibles, que es muy relevante porque en este evento, como en los huracanes, pues no es fácil suministrar en ese momento combustibles. Nuevamente preparamos el sistema eléctrico para soportar contingencias que sean altamente probables, multicontingencias, dobles o triples también, y preparamos las estrategias para, en caso de ser necesario, restablecer el sistema. Durante el evento, pues seguimos monitoreando las condiciones del clima y del sistema. Hacemos nuevamente control de flujos en la red para soportar las contingencias creíbles se hacen evaluaciones en tiempo real con análisis de redes, análisis de contingencias y también para ver si no tenemos algún problema de voltaje. De ser necesario, se realizan cortes rotativos de carga y se restablece la red cuando es posible. Después del evento, esta es una imagen de un evento que tuvimos en febrero del 2011, entre el 4 y 7 de febrero del 2011, que prácticamente toda la parte del país, en toda esta parte perdimos la generación. Toda la generación eléctrica salió de servicio. Entonces, el control que estuvimos haciendo fue con compensadores estáticos de bar para control de voltaje y obviamente hubo afectaciones de usuarios, bastantes usuarios. Aquí están los números de la generación que se afectó. Aquí está el total de la generación afectada y el número de usuarios que tuvimos dañados. Estas son gráficas de aquel evento, de toda la parte de carga que se afectó. Bueno, finalmente, al final del Frente Frío, cuando pasó, se hizo lo mismo, un recuento de la infraestructura dañada, un plan para la restauración y mientras se seguía operando con los elementos que estaban disponibles en el sistema eléctrico, tratando de abastecer la mayor cantidad de energía eléctrica a los usuarios. Otro de los fenómenos meteorológicos que también nos impactan, este no es meteorológico, parte por sequía se puede provocar el incendio, pero muchas veces es provocado por algún descuido. Pero las sequías sí tienen una integración muy importante en estos eventos. Los factores a considerar en los incendios son quema de maleza o de caña, que en México hay bastantes sembradíos de caña y muchas veces hay quema de ellos, y factores meteorológicos, como ya lo comentaba, las sequías. El personal de campo en estos casos no hay trayectorias definidas, no hay alguna alerta satelital que nos pueda decir que hay un fenómeno, simplemente es por personal de campo de los diferentes procesos, transportista, distribuidor, generador, que se da cuenta de que hay un incendio, que pasa por líneas eléctricas normalmente o cercanos a subestaciones, y pues ahí es donde nos damos cuenta y empezamos a hacer lo mismo que en los anteriores. Hacemos la verificación de qué red de transmisión puede salir de servicio. Aquí hay unos ejemplos de casos reales que nos han ocurrido, que afectan directamente la infraestructura eléctrica y por lo mismo pues afectan el suministro a los usuarios y tenemos que hacer medidas de inmediato. Ahí bloqueamos el recierre, que como les comentaba es un equipo en las líneas que nos permite liberar fallas monofásicas transitorias, pero en este caso se bloquea porque ya tenemos un evento. Hay un seguimiento estricto, se busca protección civil y pues hasta que se controle el incendio se normalizan las condiciones. En algunos casos la infraestructura es dañada por el conductor se daña, o en una subestación se puede dañar equipo como transformadores, interruptores. Las acciones, las que comenté, prácticamente estas son las que ya comenté. En el caso de tornados, los tornados en México se dan en la parte norte del país, y aunque también en el centro. Son tornados pequeños, pero sí existen. Ahí hay una asociación en México, es el CENAPRED, Centro Nacional de Prevención de Desastres y Protección Civil, que tienen alertas tempranas. Nosotros estamos siguiendo estas alertas tempranas. Como les comentaba, la mayoría de los tornados son débiles, aproximadamente el 90% son débiles, excepto en la parte norte, pegado a Texas. Ahí es donde más severos hemos tenido, eventos más severos, y sí han dañado infraestructura, líneas de transmisión de 400 kV y 230 kV. Los meses de mayor incidencia de tornados pues son de mayo a junio, es donde tenemos mayor problema de tornado. Los tornados, les decía, tenemos algunas alertas. No normalmente se producen, hay alertas de previa formación, les damos seguimiento y también preparamos la red de transmisión para soportar contingencias dobles o triples. Hay muchas veces que no se pueden prever y no son soportables las contingencias. En el año pasado, perdón, este año, en abril tuvimos apagones severos en la parte frontera, nosotros le llamamos, en esta parte del país. Tuvimos una afectación de 1000 megawatts por caída de 5 líneas de transmisión, 2 de 400, 2 de 230 y una de 138 kV, que un tornado tiró en 5 minutos. Esa vez pues no pudimos más que abastecer muy poca carga, y en 2 o 3 días después de que se recuperó la generación, porque al haber un blackout total, las plantas salieron de servicio. Dos plantas no pudieron aplicar sus procedimientos de emergencia y tuvieron daño en los generadores de vapor. Eran ciclos combinados, tuvieron daño en los generadores de vapor. Entonces tuvimos una situación que duró casi un mes. Sí abastecimos la demanda, pero estuvimos en estado de emergencia prácticamente en esa zona del país. Eso es lo que les comentaba. Básicamente, en el estado de Texas es donde hay, pegado al estado de Texas, es donde tenemos la problemática más fuerte. Es menos recurrente, pero más fuerte. Los tornados son más fuertes en esa parte. Después de los tornados, pues prácticamente es lo mismo que hacemos en todos los eventos. Nos reunimos con todos los procesos para ver qué infraestructura va a tener un daño permanente y hacemos estrategias para recuperar esa infraestructura. En lo que no está la infraestructura disponible, pues usamos otro tipo de generación, incluso generación diésel más cara, o podemos trasladar generadores móviles dependiendo del monto de carga que se tenga que suministrar. Finalmente, en sismos, como todos sabemos, un sismo no es previsible, se da en un momento inesperado. Esta parte no se puede predecir, desafortunadamente. Nosotros México está en una zona altamente sísmica, tenemos bastante sismicidad, tenemos algunas alertas sísmicas, pero cuando ya el sismo está presente, sobre todo para el centro del país, si se da en el Pacífico el fenómeno, tenemos aproximadamente 50 segundos para que el personal, tanto de los centros de control de electricidad, que ese es nuestro negocio, como el demás personal, el personal civil, pueda evacuar las instalaciones. En el caso del centro de control, pues nos preparamos. No sabemos nunca qué va a pasar, si se va a perder generación y también carga, o solo generación, o solo carga. Es muy, pues no es certero siempre un sismo. Se presenta en un momento y no sabemos los daños que nos pueda ocasionar. En esa situación, nosotros pues monitoreamos siempre la frecuencia, porque es el balance entre la carga y generación, y tomamos medidas dependiendo de qué esté pasando. No lo sabemos en ese momento, solo por mediciones. Aquí hay un ejemplo de un sismo que nos ocurrió el 21 de abril del 2013, en plena demanda máxima del sistema eléctrico en México, donde hubo una afectación de carga de este orden. Aproximadamente fueron 2000 megawatts de generación y carga que se afectaron en ese momento. Esta gráfica es una gráfica típica, y aquí es con la presencia del sismo. Y bueno, aquí, como les comentaba, en este caso no hay previsiones. Sí hacemos algunos entrenamientos a nuestros operadores si se les presentara estos fenómenos, para ver cómo reaccionen, pero ahí pues no hay nada escrito, no sabemos qué va a pasar. Nosotros lo que hacemos es mantener el balance carga-generación, monitoreamos qué generadores están disponibles, cuáles no están disponibles, los montos de carga que se perdieron, y obviamente el sistema eléctrico, como todos los sistemas eléctricos del mundo, tiene los relevadores de baja frecuencia 81 que desconectan carga automáticamente para tratar de balancear la carga y la generación y que no haya un evento mayor. Aquí hay una gráfica de cuando otro de los sismos, cuando fue bajando la frecuencia por pérdida de generación. Todos esos son generadores que se desconectaron, y también cargas y operación de 81 de los esquemas de baja frecuencia para recuperar la frecuencia y el balance. Esos son ejemplos de sismos. Este fue en 2013, el 21 de abril, es el mismo que les presenté hace un momento, pero ya con mayor detalle y con un zoom en cuanto a los momentos. Y bueno, las medidas después.
Mr. Cuellar, I hate to interrupt, but if you could please wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so we can get to the question and answer session.
Okay, sí, ya voy a terminar. Gracias.
Great, thank you.
Bueno, y aquí se identifican las medidas posteriores, pues nada más es hacer los reportes prácticamente y nuevamente ver qué infraestructura quedó dañada para hacer los planes de restablecimiento en caso de que se haya quedado algo dañado. Y una parte importante, pues que tenemos un simulador de entrenamiento. En México hay un simulador de entrenamiento donde los operadores del sistema eléctrico están capacitándose para hacer las sesiones. ¿Qué pasaría si hay huracanes? Se reproducen eventos que ya hemos tenido, eventos que ya nos han sucedido, para que estén preparados y puedan actuar de manera rápida, tanto en huracanes, tornados, frentes fríos, incendios y sismos. Todo eso, pues cada año estamos capacitando. El CENACE en México, el Centro de Control, está formado por 8 centros regionales y un centro nacional, con su centro alterno. Todos los operadores son capacitados, cada quien en su área geográfica, y los del Centro Nacional y Centro Nacional Alterno, pues para todo el país. Sería todo de mi presentación. Muchas gracias.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. We are now going to go into the question and answer session, and we're still working on connecting with Mr. Mateo and getting him back online. So if we are able to connect with him, we'll jump into his presentation. Just a reminder for everyone, if you have a question, please enter it into the questions pane on the GoToWebinar toolbar. We will start things off with a question for Dr. Ellis. We received a question asking if you could go into details on some other resiliency measures that aren't directly tied to disaster events necessarily, but have more to do with a rural community application. And Gunter, feel free to chime in as well.
Sure. This is the question in Spanish or in English?
In English.
Sure. I'll respond in English then. There are so the question is other examples that do not involve interconnected situations, perhaps. So I do have an example in the packet that I will share with all of you. In fact, if you're interested, I can maybe show a slide or two here. But let me just say, we've looked at resilience of rural communities also for a very long time. They tend to, let me share my screen here so you can show what I'm talking about. Show my screen. I don't know if you can see this example here. But this particular example has to do with resilience considerations related to fuel supply to rural communities in Alaska. As you know, the situation in Alaska is such that the majority of the communities in Alaska, or over 250 or so, actually receive electric service through microgrids. And these are very extreme climate conditions, as you can imagine. For many months of the year, the roads are inaccessible or very difficult to get there. And also, these are communities that are facing climate change issues. So places where the tundra, the ice is melting underneath the location of the facilities, or the towns, and they're having to move, actually. Imagine that. And so some of these affect, obviously, the electric infrastructure. There are many communities there that rely on diesel generators for the most part. In fact, this is a better picture of that. All of these little communities with the little drop of oil, most of those are primarily using diesel generation to supply electricity. So this is an example of a project that Sandia, NREL, and others did in Alaska, in this community of Shugnak, where the idea here is, how do we make this community more resilient to fuel supply, right? And so that was the idea in terms of resilience. And so one of the things that we needed to do here is to see if we could apply some of these resilience metrics and methodologies to achieve a 50% reduction in imported fuel. We wanted to do that in a manner that was sustainable for the community. So it was not at any cost, but can you do something such as the addition of solar and wind and energy storage to meet this resilience goals in this case for this particular community. And so we did a little bit of work here at Sandia using the tool that I described before, the microgrid design tool. You can see some of the examples on the right-hand side of the kinds of results that we got. But really, we found out that obviously there are many different alternatives that you can try. This summary here talks about some of the specific design options considered for this particular community. So over on the right-hand side here, you can see my mouse, you can see that this is the baseline. We're using something like 12, almost 13 gallons an hour of fuel, typically, in this location. And so what we're trying to do here is find alternatives, for example, adding wind and solar that could reduce this fuel consumption by large amounts. So you can see here that in this particular case, by adding solar and wind, we were able to reduce the fuel consumption to something like 3 gallons an hour. You can go even further to something like 2 gallons an hour, but at an increased cost, as you can see there on this curve. And so this is a very interesting solution here because it is the least cost solution that provides the most change in the fuel consumption per hour. So this hopefully is an example of the kinds of things that we look at for rural communities. There are many other kinds of metrics that can apply. In this case, I mentioned before that in the case of New Orleans, we're interested in metrics that have to do more with social welfare. And so in a case like this rural community in Alaska, access to things like, school and emergency services and things like that was very important. So we could have applied those metrics as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The next question is for Gunter for the prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover steps that you highlighted. Do they relate similarly for vertically regulated and deregulated utilities? And if so, also, how can you demand response programs be modeled to integrate elements of resilience?
Okay, for the first one, yeah, I don't think we would distinguish this approach for different entities. I think these are the typical steps that you would follow. And so the analysis, the modeling would follow all the same, regardless whether you are a regulated utility or a deregulated generation company, or vertically integrated or separated, where you have your different business lines separate. So I showed an example for the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that actually covers vertically integrated utilities in the south as well as deregulated utilities in the north. So it applies across the board. So that would be the answer to that. So no difference. For the second one, demand response. So we do. So the Department of Energy is looking at funding research. There's a variety of different projects that are starting to look at this, and will continue to look at this. How distributed resources can provide, can serve towards resilience goals. So demand response would be part of this, but this would go broader, would include distributed solar generation, rooftop panel systems, battery systems at homes or within neighborhoods. How can they make the system more resilient? So there's tools available that allow you to analyze this, and there's still work that needs to be done to get a better understanding of how this all works together. But it is actively being addressed by a variety of different laboratories, including Sandia, Argonne, NREL, and there's actually another large activity that's going to be initiated as part of a recent call for proposals that the Department of Energy had, where some of those projects will look specifically at that issue.
Great. Thank you for
add a quick perspective here as well.
It's very brief. We just reestablished Mr. Mateo's connection.
Okay, great. I'll be 30 seconds here. In some of these projects that we work on, it matters sometimes from a regulatory and from a policy perspective what the solutions look like. And so one of the interesting questions is whether customers can own certain assets and whether those energy assets are able to monetize their operation in wholesale markets and things like that. Sometimes it matters, so that's another very interesting question for a deregulated market like we have now everywhere in the Americas.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. We would now like to get Mr. Mateo. If you're able to hear us, we'll turn things over to you. If you can share your screen and unmute your microphone. And we would love to hear your presentation. It looks like your microphone is still muted. So if you can pull up your PowerPoint. Mr. Mateo, we can also pull up your presentation for you. Are you able to unmute your microphone? Mr. Mateo, if you could please click the button with the white microphone on the GoToWebinar toolbar. It looks like you are self-muted right now. Mr. Mateo, we are going to try and show your presentation on our end. We still can't hear you, unfortunately. Oh, it looks like you've just unmuted. Are you able to hear us? All right. I apologize, everyone, for the technical difficulties we're experiencing. Just give us one moment while we try to get his microphone connected. All right, apologies, everyone. We're still having a couple of technical difficulties with the microphone. I have one more question for Abe that has come in, and we'll go ahead and ask that while we work on the audio for Mr. Mateo. Abe, have any of the New Orleans microgrids or other recommendations be implemented? Have they been implemented? And if so, could you give us a little detail on that?
The answer to the question is no. The recommendations are now the subject of decision-making process that involves, of course, the city council, the utilities, and some of the state agencies. Typically what happens is that the designs that are provided through these frameworks, these resilience frameworks, have to go through the normal process of funding, and so that's where that process is. But just to give you another plug for the third example I did not present, that's for a transportation project in New Jersey. We, with other national laboratories and other partners, went through the same process, provided a resilience design from microgrid, which was then approved for funding and is currently under construction. So yes, they are part of the process, but you have to start with a definition of the options, and then the stakeholders themselves have to seek the funding and get the project to proceed.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. We are still experiencing some technical issues on the connection. So we'd just like to get some final thoughts from the panelists, and if we can get a few words in from Mr. Mateo, that would be wonderful. But I apologize to everyone that this hasn't been terribly successful technically. But Abe, why don't we start with you if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I will just offer here that, as you have heard from the three panelists here, the concepts of resilience are not necessarily new. In my opinion, is that bringing together these ideas to do proactive planning is where the innovation exists. So it's not just to react to some of these difficult events, but can we do something from an investment standpoint that can be approved through the normal process and show, using these metrics and using these tools, the full set of values that investment in resilience can do for the population and for the system and for the economy. That is where we're trying to go with resilience, to include all of those aspects. I will also say that at the end of the day, whatever resilience options are selected for investment, we can never forget the fact that these stakeholders, the community in which these investments are made, the government that make those investments and so on, they are going to own and operate the system for a very long time. So it is very, very important to look at the sustainability aspects of these investments, everything included from a business case standpoint, all the way to the regulatory and policy aspects, how these investments are going to be sustained in the long term.
Hello, Mr. Mateo, are you able to hear us?
Yes, we are hearing.
Okay, great. I think we'd just like to, if you could please, unfortunately we don't have a ton of time remaining on the webinar, but we'd still love to hear from you. If there are a few, about 5 minutes of details that we'd love to get from the Dominican Republic and your experiences, please feel free to share.
Okay. Eso no pasa de ellos. No me gusta la presentación de ellos. La tenemos ya, ellos no tienen.
All right, Mr. Mateo, we only have a couple minutes left, so if there are just a few, any details you'd like to share?
Hello, Stephanie, are you hearing to all?
Yes, I can hear you, but we only have a couple minutes. Do you have any of your experiences you'd like to present at this time? All right. Unfortunately, it appears that the audio connection is still experiencing some issues. So we are, yeah, it looks like I'm so sorry about that, everybody. We are going to wrap things up here. Gunter, did you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yes, certainly. So to me, it's to me, it's sort of like this entire topic of resilience is a very broad topic. You know, we tend to work in a particular sector. So with people who work on the grid, and we have people who work in the natural gas industry. We have you know, we have these individual industrial sectors and folks with expertise in each one of those. This is one that really requires bringing together people across the sectors, across the communities. And so we try to get there as just starting, where we bring the grid operators, the power systems engineers together with the emergency personnel, trying to understand how certain things work together. So, you know, we can make investments in our systems to strengthen the system, to reinforce our systems, our infrastructure. We can develop microgrids, we can upgrade fences, we can upgrade levees around certain areas to keep water out. But we can be fairly sure the next major event will occur again. We don't know when, we don't know exactly where. And so it always means we have to count on getting hit by something, and we have to be able to respond, recover too. So is one thing, investing in different technologies to upgrade our infrastructure is another, but it has to go hand in hand with response and recovery. And so to take a holistic approach to this very complicated issue.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mr. Cuellar from the government of Mexico, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share in English or Spanish, whatever you are most comfortable in?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's very important for the government to with the increment of growing to the wind and solar generation, it's very important not forget the reliability of the system. It's important not close a lot plants with normal generators with oil or gas. It is to do a balance, because if we understand that the new and the ecological theme is solar and wind, but we try to don't understand the reliability and supply to consumers. It's very important, the political. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience and our panelists for sticking with us on this slightly technically challenging webinar. I invite you to check the Solution Center's website if you'd like to view the slides or listen to a recording from today's presentation, as well as any previously held webinars. Additionally, you'll find information on upcoming webinars and other training events. We are also now posting webinar recordings to the Solution Center YouTube channel. Please allow about 1 week for the audio recording to be posted. And finally, I would like to kindly ask you to take a moment to complete a short survey that will appear when we conclude the webinar. Please, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at future Clean Energy Solutions Center events. This concludes our webinar.